All right. Good evening, friends. My name is Tannum Davis Bowen, and along with Warrington Parker, we are the co-chairs of the new Battery Society called Perspectives at the Battery. Perspectives at the Battery aims to showcase cultural experiences of all Battery members around a series of cultivated conversations. We seek to empower safe, inclusive discussions and to create a greater sense of belonging within the broader Battery community. Today's conversation about Juneteenth is our first foray into this mission. Tonight, we have an extraordinary panel who will help bring a very important conversation to life as we celebrate Juneteenth later this week and explore ways to expand our experience and expression of freedom for communities all over the country. I will start by introducing our panel, and then I'll turn it over to Anasa, who will be our guide for the evening. Natalie is up first. She is the author of Queen Sugar, which has been adapted for a sixth television season by and co-produced by Ava DuVernay and Oprah Winfrey. Her new nonfiction book is We Are Each Other's Harvest, celebrating African American farmers, land, and legacy, and just came out in April. It chronicles the history of Black people's connection to the land from emancipation to the present. Her writing has appeared in National Geographic, The Bitter Southerner, the Oprah Magazine, Best Women's Travel Writing, Volume 9, and numerous anthologies. Up next is Peter. Peter is a Rocker Fellow. Peter, I will tell you that your introduction is very tongue-tied. A Peabody Award-winning and an Emmy-nominated film producer, writer, director, and social justice activist. He is known for writing, directing, producing such works as Follow Me Home, La Mission, Dolores, and the upcoming film Black Rooster through his company, Five Stick Films. Peter is also the lead of the project team spearheading the Village SF, which we'll learn about today, which will be an intertribal community coalition of Native organizations and groups that will serve San Francisco's indigenous population. Raised by a strong indigenous single mother from Peru, his family was part of the American Indian occupation of Alcatraz, the Wounded Knee standoff, and the farm workers movement. As a consultant, organizer, and community member, he has worked with the International Indian Treaty Council, Amazon Watch, Friendship House Association of American Indians, Homies, and Instituto Familiar de la Razón, forgive my Spanish accent there. And Adamica is an experienced clinical epidemiologist and hospital and healthcare system executive who loves to help people understand health and healthcare through storytelling, connection, and culture. She is the founding executive director of Health Tech for Medicare, HT4M, which is a collaborative convening of payers, providers, policymakers, and innovative entrepreneurs collectively advocating for health equity and improvement of Medicaid program on a national scale. Adamica is a public health leader, hospital executive, and humanitarian who holds numerous certificates and awards, affectionately known as Madam Medicare on social media, and is also the co-host of the global podcast Bring a Friend. And lastly, Anasa Troutman, our guide for the evening, who many of you know. Anasa is a cultural strategist, writer, producer, and entrepreneur, and is committed to shifting global culture to a culture of care. As president and CEO of the Big We, Anasa and her team engage deeply in storytelling as a pathway to transformation and executes culture-based strategies for artists, organizations, and brands that are aligned with their vision of a just and loving world. Based in Memphis, Tennessee, Anasa has provided strategic and creative support to many important cultural, political, and social justice spaces. For those of you who don't know Anasa, you're in for a treat today. I want to welcome our panel to the conversation. So Anasa, I turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited about this. It's going to be so good. These are some of my favorite people. So let me just get into it before I just get so excited we lose track. Okay. Hi, everybody. Welcome to this amazing, important, exciting conversation. Again, my name is Anasa Troutman, founder of the Big We, and I am zooming in from the banks of the Mississippi River on the land of the Chickasaw Nation, now known as Memphis, Tennessee. It is such an incredible honor for me to be here this evening and to celebrate this most auspicious holiday that we will all be celebrating this weekend, Juneteenth. We're here in a virtual space, but I want you to know that in addition to being exciting for us to be here together, we're also really excited to be here with you. I know that we can't see you and we can't hear your voices, but we can feel your presence and we can see you in the chat. So I want to encourage you to go ahead and say hello to us and to whoever else is in the room. Let us know your name, where you're from, and what you're excited about this evening. We want to hear from you all through the conversation. So if you hear something that makes you feel excited, or if you have a question or something that you just don't understand, please put it in the chat. We're going to have a Q&A at the end, so we will be using the Q&A function. So if you want to have a question answered by one of the panelists at the end, make sure you put that question in the Q&A box, and you can do that anytime throughout the night. Okay. Before we begin, I want to give honor to our ancestors with a word of thanks. And I also want to do that by reading the story of Juneteenth as told by the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture. Some of us have been celebrating Juneteenth all our lives, and some of us are just hearing about it for the first time. But whatever your relationship with Juneteenth is, it is always healing and uplifting to hear this story. So I'm going to just take 2 minutes out to share this story with you, and then we're going to jump right in. On Freedom's Eve, or the eve of January 1st, 1863, the first watch night services took place. On that night, enslaved and freed African Americans gathered in churches and private homes all across the country, awaiting news that the Emancipation Proclamation had taken effect. At the stroke of midnight, prayers were answered as all enslaved people in Confederate states were declared legally free. Union soldiers, many of whom were Black, marched onto plantations and across cities in the South, reading small copies of the Emancipation Proclamation, spreading the news of freedom in Confederate states. Only through the 13th Amendment did emancipation end slavery throughout the United States. But not everyone in Confederate territory would immediately be free. Even though the Emancipation Proclamation was made effective in 1863, it could not be implemented in places still under Confederate control. As a result, in the westernmost Confederate state of Texas, enslaved people would not be free until much later. Freedom finally came on June 19th, 1865, when some 2,000 Union troops arrived in Galveston Bay, Texas. The Army announced that the more than 250,000 enslaved Black people in that state were free by executive decree. This day became to be known as Juneteenth by the newly freed people in Texas. The post-emancipation period known as Reconstruction from 1865 to 1877 marked an era of hope, uncertainty, and struggle for the nation as a whole. Formerly enslaved people immediately sought to reunify their families, establish schools, run for political office, push radical legislation, and even sue their slaveholders for compensation. Given the 200 years plus of enslavement, such changes were nothing short of amazing. Not even a generation out of slavery, African Americans were inspired and empowered to transform their lives in their country. Juneteenth marks our country's second Independence Day. Although it has long been celebrated in African American communities, this monumental event remains largely unknown to most Americans. The historical legacy of Juneteenth shows the value of never giving up hope in uncertain times. The National Museum of African American History and Culture is a community space where that spirit of hope lives on, a place where historical events like Juneteenth are shared and new stories with equal urgency are told. Tonight, I would like to think that our gathering space is one such place where we can tell stories of the past, together create stories of the future, and do it all in the spirit of hope and gratitude. Tonight, I am joined by literally some of my favorite hearts and minds, Natalie, Adamica Arthur, and Peter Bratt. Ooh, I can't wait for you to meet them. I want to start by giving each of them a few minutes to introduce themselves and to talk a little bit about their work in their own way. And if you feel so moved, to tell us what freedom feels like to you tonight. Let's start with you, Natalie.
Oh boy.
I
Hello
know. Big
everybody. I'm
question, right?
Natalie Bazil, author of Queen Sugar and the novel Queen Sugar, and most recently, We Are Each Other's Harvest, celebrating African American farmers' land and legacy, which is a nonfiction book. Um, Boy, what does freedom feel like? Um, you know, sitting here today, that's a really challenging question, uh, because I feel like we are at a moment of tremendous opportunity, but also a moment of tremendous challenge. Um, a lot of the work that I've done in both my novel and now in this new nonfiction book really explores this question of Black people's connection to the land, and um, the land representing for so many Black people this idea of freedom and sovereignty. I think Anasa, about the story that you just shared about um, the Juneteenth, right? And how that came to be, and how there was almost a 2-year gap between the Emancipation Proclamation and the enslaved people in Texas learning about that they were actually free. And it reminds me of the story of General Sherman's march through Atlanta, and the fact that he actually dispatched Secretary of War Stanton to meet with Black people, Black ministers, to ask them the question. Freedom was dawning. And Stanton met with about 20 Black ministers um, to ask them, what can this nation do? What do you want? What does freedom represent to you? And their response, Garrison Frazier, was a Methodist minister who really was the spokesman for the group. And he said to them, give us land. Land is what Black people need. Give us land and then basically leave us alone. Let us till this soil by our own hands. And so for me, when I think about what freedom feels like, I really do have to reflect back on this question of what is our connection to the soil, both as people of color, African Americans, but also Indigenous people, and what does that represent? And we're in this moment where there is a huge struggle underway for both Black farmers who are on the brink of maybe having some of their struggles addressed. I think of what's happening to Indigenous people across this land, and the fact that maybe we're finally actually willing to acknowledge um, their struggles and the land loss there. So I'm really torn about that question. I wish I had one answer for you, but I don't, because this is a really bittersweet moment.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Adamica, will you introduce yourself and tell us how freedom feels for you today?
Yes. Well, one, I'm honored and happy to be here. My name is Adamica Arthur, and I essentially get the honor and privilege every day to think about how do we use our incredible innovation and technology arms to improve the quality, equity, and access to care for people on Medicaid, their families, and our communities. And most people don't know Medicaid is the largest insurance program in the country. Serves about 1/5 of Americans. So speaking of California, it serves, it's over 14.5 million people in California alone. So 1 in 3 people in the great state of California are on Medicaid. And I get a chance to do a lot of convening, really through with entrepreneurs and payers, providers, policymakers, advocates, investors, and really do that through a couple of different means. We do that through innovative programs, service delivery, infrastructure and ecosystem development, and issue and policy advocacy. But what freedom means to me right now, it's a bit of a fragile freedom. And I say that with really the movement for Black lives and access to liberation, we often do not think about the societal, structural, and institutional barriers to something as basic as healthcare, as basic as our ability to breathe, right? Our ability to have children, some of the most basic fundamental components, our ability to have dignity when we die. And so I think that fragile freedom, and it's no more evident than something that all of us have been facing, the dreaded mask, right? the color of the coronavirus and the color of the deaths of the coronavirus really tell you the toll that Indigenous and Black lives have made in regards to the dismantling of our public health infrastructure, and are thinking that disease states in this country really only impact certain people. So I will say it's a bit of a fragile freedom. I'm very blessed to be here and to access the freedoms I have of privilege and power, but really recognize we've got a long way to go.
Thank you, Adamica. Brother Peter, introduce yourself to us and let us know what freedom feels like for you today.
Thank you, Inasa. Again, I want to repeat how honored I am to be here with the relatives on this acknowledgement of what happened in 1865, Juneteenth, a time that really should be a national holiday. I'll just be straight up. Especially for a country founded on the ideals of liberation and freedom. Oh my God, why don't we acknowledge and look at this story? This is really our collective story. This is the heart of it right here. So I'm really honored to be here. Thank you for inviting me, Inasa, Natalie, Adamica. My name is Peter Bratt, and I'm from the Quechua people of the South, from Tuantansuyu. My mother came here in the 50s, and she is a matriarch, single mother of 5, and she was heavily involved in the indigenous civil rights movement of the 60s, which was inspired by the Black liberation struggle that was taking place. Native people like the farm workers and the brown berets saw what was happening in the Black community and were inspired. And my mother took part in the occupation of Alcatraz. And so me, my brothers and sisters were raised in the movement. And Natalie, I can't wait to get into this conversation later on, but I too have been thinking a lot about the land and farming and our relationship to it as people of color, green spaces, and our access to it. For me, I think, freedom is really tied up, and I learned this from you, Inasa. Freedom for me is really tied up to the concept of home. So much of our life, whether spiritually or just on this physical plane, seems about our search to find a place, where we can be our true selves, where we're seen, where we're heard, respected, appreciated, and ultimately loved.
Yes.
And I think many of our communities, though we have been here for generations, centuries, are still looking for that home where we are seen, heard, and treated equally. And so freedom for me really is they're intimately tied, and freedom is also tied to the land. And it's it doesn't escape me that Natalie mentioned, General Sherman, and after the Civil War, it was General Sherman who came up with the scorched earth policy to wipe out Plains tribes. And he's the one who also came up with the solution to the Indian problem, which was to destroy their commissary. That means the connection to traditional foods, traditional lands, and food sources like the buffalo. They wiped it out, and that was their way to dispossess and control and erase indigenous people. So this is going to be a really great conversation, and I can't wait till we get into this more, talking about the land. But thank you for having me.
Okay, so as you can tell, we have 3 of the most soulful, thoughtful, brilliant people I know here. So I want you all to really be in a conversation with each other, but I do have some specific questions for each of you before we do that. So I want to go back to you, Natalie, because I've been thinking about you a lot this week as I've been preparing for this conversation. And part of the reason is because the first time that I remember hearing about and celebrating Juneteenth, and everyone was really excited about it, like, this is amazing. And I was mad. I was mad about it because I was like, 2.5 years? We're supposed to be talking about that, right? And I've been meditating on this idea of freedom deferred and what it means to be free and not know.
Yeah.
And when chills just thinking about that. And when I've been thinking about you, I've been thinking about the work that you do with Black farmers, and the idea that you have this land, you have this resource, you have access, and there's still something keeping you bound and making you feel like that freedom that you feel like you should have is still just outside of your grasp. And I am wondering about your experience with working with these farmers, the stories that you're telling right now, the stories you've been telling through Queen Sugar, and does that resonate with you? Like, what is the experience of the folks who you are committed to in terms of the juxtaposition of freedom perceived and freedom delayed?
Yeah. Well, I think what's interesting when you look at kind of the landscape of Black farmers, indeed BIPOC farmers, really, because
Okay.
this is really a movement that has spread throughout these communities of color who are really redefining what it means to be connected to the land. And this idea of not just social justice, but sovereignty, food sovereignty, um, and community.
Mm,
There are people who are really at the forefront of this movement. I am really just a chronicler, a storyteller, right? Somebody who has tremendous appreciation for the work that these folks are doing and has enough distance from it that I can kind of step back and, you know, tell the story that sometimes if you're so close to it, you're so busy being in it that
yeah.
you don't necessarily, you're not thinking about the story and the connections, right? At least from kind of the 10,000 foot view. But I think what is both encouraging and frustrating,
Mm,
uh, and it reminds me of the way our ancestors must have felt, you know, continuing to toil under this illusion that they were still, um, enslaved when they weren't, and the feeling of lost time and lost opportunity. And I think when I think about what is happening with these farmers now, what is encouraging to me is a lot of these younger farmers, especially, they're not waiting. They are already moving forward. They're not waiting for permission. They're not waiting for anything. They are creating these opportunities. They are redefining these relationships with themselves and with the land. And they really have a vision for what is possible. And that is a future that includes everyone, right? That acknowledges the land loss, not just on the part of Black people, but Native people, right? And they are really trying to come up with a different formula, totally, which is what is inspiring to me, right? I think what is frustrating is to see the external forces that are at work, the structural and systematic forces that it's like, I feel like it is this big wheel, right? This engine that is moving forward, not necessarily at a fast clip,
mm,
but at a pace that is consistently grinding people under. And I'm not being very articulate here, but that is the thing that is so frustrating. So what am I thinking of? I'm thinking of, for example, the Biden administration's
mm,
decision to address the wrongs of Black farmers, build into their budget relief, debt relief, education, all this stuff for Black farmers and Native American farmers, Indigenous farmers who have been suffering for generations. That is finally moving forward. And then what happens last week? You have Stephen Miller from the former administration team up with a conservative law firm and not only sue the Biden administration, but then to have a judge decide that he is going to side with them and at least temporarily halt Biden's plan to, give Black farmers and Native American farmers debt relief, right? And so this is the thing that can be so frustrating for me. I feel frustrated on behalf of these farmers to, once again, some kind of freedom is within reach, just at the edge of their fingertips. And then you have these big structures and systems that gear up and halt that progress. And so this is why I had trouble, Anasa, answering your first question, because had you asked me this time last week, I would have said freedom is on the horizon, right? But now we find ourselves having to gear up for yet another fight. And I don't mean to sound like a downer here, but this is the reality that we continue to face. And so
I mean, you're not being a downer, you're just telling the truth. Like, when I was listening to you talk, I'm thinking about two things that ring out to me with the irony of it all. The first being, it was another 6 months after Juneteenth when Black folks who lived in non-Confederate states were free. Because, for those of us who have studied history, we know that the Emancipation Proclamation was not some moral standing. It was a political and economic move to end the war, right?
Yes.
So Lincoln wasn't really concerned with the freedom of Black people. He was concerned with keeping the country together, right? So even then, even after waiting 2.5 years, it was still another 6 months if you were enslaved in a non-Confederate state or you were a runaway or whatever, for you to have your liberation. And then the second thing that I always think about when I talk to you is the fact that former slave owners were paid reparations for the loss of property when their slaves were freed. And so to me, you're like, yes, we're free, but I have to wait 2.5 years. I have to wait 3 years. And by the way, the guy who used to own me just got a big fat check. And I'm out here trying to figure out what it is that I'm going to do to feed my family, right? So I think that your commentary on this, like, being stuck in the middle of being hopeful and being dejected, is completely reasonable and part of our history, honestly. I want to go to you, Peter, for a moment, because the conversation that Natalie has about land makes me always think of you, because as someone, lots of us are now in this conversation about access to land and capital as a pathway to liberation for our communities. And, one of the things that I struggle with is, as a Black woman who comes from the legacy of enslaved Africans on both sides of my family, and thinking about the fact that the land that we are now working to own is actually not any of ours in the first place, because we are actually talking about empowering ourselves through the ownership of land stolen from Indigenous folks in this country. So I want you to talk a little bit about the conundrum that we face as Indigenous and Black folks who are thinking about land ownership. And I would love for you to talk a little bit more about the project that you're doing in San Francisco that addresses this. And whenever you're ready, I know we have a video clip that we can play, and I really want to share that with people because I am completely in love with the work that you're doing. Everyone needs to know about it.
Great. I could talk to Natalie's points all night, all day.
Listen, let's do it.
This is the kind of the space where I've been living, which is all centered around land. And most people don't know that, the famous iconic lines in the Declaration of Independence written by Thomas Jefferson, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, was originally life, liberty, and the pursuit of private property. And much of the United States was an experiment in private property. And, people often forget that, the original American colonies was this little strip on the Eastern seaboard, but they had the vision. That's the Second Amendment. We get all these other histories, but they had to get access to the land, which meant the moving of people. And so, this also made the way, for capitalist extraction. And so, you have to have a system. When you dehumanize a people like that, you have to create a system that makes it okay to do that. And that's where we create the hierarchies. Men over women, white people over non-white people, human over non-human, and everything gets turned into a resource. And so when we talk about freedom, in the indigenous sense, freedom also requires respect and gratitude toward the creation, the natural world. And it also requires how we consider our footprints, our actions impact our future generations. They say, think 7 generations behind, 7 generations forward.
Yeah.
But I think one of the reasons why we see this hiccup happening when we're talking about racial equity at this moment of reckoning, particularly for farmers, Black farmers and farmers of color, there's a backlash happening right now. You see critical race theory or reallocation of resources. There's a backlash because for a long time we have been resources, and resources are not supposed to own the land. We're supposed to work the land, and so we're kind of thwarting that whole system. And I did a film on Dolores Huerta, who helped organize farm workers who, farm workers feed the country, but they don't own the land. They are resources and they are exploited. It's modern day slavery. And they're a powerless class. And so when we talk about land ownership for people of color, I can't help but think of what Malcolm said. We can't free ourselves unless we can feed ourselves. And right now, and Natalie knows this, it's something like over 90% of all farms are white owned. And so when we talk about our communities getting access to land and growing our own food, it's a systemic threat. And so I think that's also why we're seeing this backlash. But that all said, I do want to mention and frame this video you're about to see. And that is, I was born and raised in the American Indian community here in San Francisco. And many people don't realize that under the Federal Termination Act, there was a relocation program, a forced relocation of Native people to urban centers across the country. San Francisco was one of those destinations. Housing, jobs, social services was all promised. And of course, when relatives got here, there wasn't anything. And in that process, and over the course of decades and centuries, Native people have been erased, but I would say urban natives, which are really intertribal and increasingly interracial, are doubly erased. People don't think natives exist, and natives in the city, that's really gone from the conversation. And so we have a lot of our Native people have been here 3 and 4 generations and don't have a lot of access to green spaces. So the Native community in San Francisco, we're relatively homeless. We don't have a physical space to gather as community. So we got together. It was kind of through the pandemic, the crisis of the pandemic. We formed a coalition, and we said we're going to build a village in this urban center, and we're we have a rooftop farm. We're going to be producing over 4,000 pounds of food and traditional medicines a year, and eventually, Natalie, I got to get with you on this. We want to get some satellites outside of the city where we can connect our people back to the land and kind of reintroduce some of the traditions that were systematically erased. So what you're about to see is we're trying to get the word out about what we're doing, and that's what this video kind of speaks to.
Amazing.
We don't have land, and of course, to us, land is everything. Creator put us on the land for a specific reason, to take care of that place. Our sacred duty is is to take care of the land and to take care of the people on the land.
What we need here, medical, dental, mental health, or our children, our grandchildren will have a place to go, a place to heal. A village, to me, right here, this is sacred land.
I don't want to generalize, but I feel like a lot of people think that Native Americans don't exist anymore, or that we're in such small numbers that we're irrelevant. And so being able to come to like a large city like San Francisco and having a safe place where you feel like you're understood makes me really proud and excited.
The village is hope. We need to build something great. We need to build something that we want to leave our children with, to leave their children, something that's going to be sustainable in this urban environment.
Our children are our future. I think that the more they come, the more knowledge they know, the more that they'll get to learn, the more that they can share. My son still carries on my culture, and now he'll have a place to come and share with his kids.
This is just that sense to really build a stronghold in San Francisco that says that Native people are here, that we've been here, and then also say, look to the future for our children, that they have this ability to have roots again.
For our young people in this city, this idea of a village is a returning back to their center, as a returning back to their truth. The village is that center. The village is that hub. If it not for a young person wanting that at one time, we wouldn't be here. They've called it. We are responding to their call.
We walk in the light with our brothers and sisters. We stand and fight with a drum, a song, this prophets change of time.
Peter, I have so much to say about
I get
that.
all fired up when I
So I need to interrupt the conversation because while the video was playing, which is like so incredible, Tanam, who is our host tonight, just sent us all a text message that says the Senate unanimously passes a bill making Juneteenth a federal holiday.
Wow.
It just came through on our phones literally 30 minutes ago,
So,
right while we were talking. Okay.
So 2020 was the first time that Juneteenth got put on Google calendars,
Right?
And here we are in 2021 now as a national holiday.
Holy cow. That's big.
Right?
Wow.
This is
Huge.
Oh,
I can see home on the horizon.
Wow.
I mean, and there you go, right? Like this is a story of Juneteenth right here in front of us. I'm covered with chills from head to toe right now. That's amazing.
Wow.
Wow.
Now we need to do the education to teach people exactly what they're celebrating.
Yeah.
That's right. Well, I'll tell you what, the holiday is called Juneteenth National Independence Day as a U.S. holiday commemorating the end of slavery in the United States. That is what the language is. So yeah, there you go. We can, that's something to celebrate. It's not everything. It ain't everything.
And I was with you when I heard the news.
I was with you.
That's right. We were together, all of us on this webinar.
Talking about the work, doing the work, and that's amazing. So I want to pivot a little bit because what Peter just presented to us, Adamica, is really, to me, the power of culture, right? Peter and his community are saying, we are disparate. We're flung to the far right, to the far edges of this city, of this country, and we want to come together and experience and recreate what is culturally healthy for us. And at the Big we talk a lot about cultural wellness as like our pathway to liberation, because if you want well policies and if you want well people, you have to have a culture that is well. And I want for you to really talk about your work as a healthcare professional, as someone who thinks about wellness all the time, and really like what is our relationship to our wellness and our freedom, and what is our pathway to actually be able to have a real conversation about what a well culture looks like.
Yes. Well, I would start with, true racial justice cannot exist where there are barriers to health and wellness that still are blockades. And I think that's the first step, right? Like, we have to be committed to ending the silos that keep minoritized and marginalized groups from accessing the care that they deserve. And that's more than employee resource groups. That's more than, thinking about putting an equity statement on your website. It's really thinking about the impact of racism in healthcare. And really starting to look at the power and privilege structures that have created poor outcomes, but are creating worse outcomes today. So a great example of that is, like you, Anasa, I have both sides of my family have come from, the indigenous, slave trade. And when I have a living grandmother who's in her 90s, and she had children starting a little bit over 70 years ago. And it was safer for her to give birth over 70 years ago than it is for me to give birth as a Black woman today. That tells you something about our structures of bias, our structures of community. Peter talked about the bartering that was done to create our freedoms. But we used to have systems in our community that was, we used to have granny midwives. We used to have women that would come around, or people that would come around and help our babies come into this world. We used to have a structure by which, we still work on a village mentality now, right? Because it definitely takes a village to raise children. But we have broken down and stripped away all of our processes to function. And so we often don't think about things such as stress, right? Like access to outdoor space. You guys are talking about farming, and I'm thinking about, it's not just the fields, it's also the forests. Like we need to have access to places to really be able to learn how to commune, right? We are a people that commune through music, through dance, through breathing. Our breath is so important, right? And when we are constricted with our breath, which most people are, we don't, that's a fickle freedom right there. Like your inability to live in a country that doesn't recognize the health inequities that are so pronounced. And we talk about equality, but we really need to focus on a racial justice issue that is health care equity to me.
I think that's really interesting, the way you just frame that, about like the things that we're not thinking about, right? Even folks who are doing this work every day and really thinking, being really thoughtful about racial justice and social justice are things that we're missing. And I want to kind of get out of the way, because I really am eager for you all to talk to each other. But I'm curious about, from each of your perspective, in the place that you're sitting in the world as individuals and people who are doing this amazing work. I'm wondering what we're missing. Like what am I missing that we're not talking about, that we should be thinking about? And are there things that you're curious about that you've heard from the other panelists today?
Well, this isn't necessarily I don't know that I can answer that question right now, but Peter, as you were talking about the village and the fact that there has been erasure of the indigenous story and where Native people are and where they're not, I was thinking about, do you know Tommy Orange, and his novel They're There? And so I know this just because it's in my world of books and everything, but Tommy Orange is an author who had this collection of, it's really a novel that came out a few years ago. He's right here in Oakland. And the whole point of this story, this book, fiction, is to tell a different story about Indigenous people and where they are and what their lives are. And so as I was watching your film about the village, and I was just thinking, you know, this is a whole population that, you know, for many people is invisible. And it takes all sorts of Peter's work in film, in organizing, books, you know, policy, to make people visible. And that just kind of blows my mind. So I just wanted to add that.
Well, and I was just gonna mention that is a piece that we could actually reclaim, right? Our stories.
Yeah.
The reclamation of our stories goes back to what we all know well, right? And so, you know, we all had coded language for certain things growing up. At least I did. Like sugar was diabetes, right? Like, I mean, you know, like having coded language helps us understand what ailments our families have been dealing with, you know, good, bad, or indifferent, right? You know, who lived to be, you know, what did they do to give them space to live so long, right? Who fed everyone and how, right? Like, where did we get those like scrappy resources? And I think as we think about an economic engine in this country, you know, we've talked about essential workers, which, you know, more than half of essential workers in this country, we've got, you know, certainly the fields, we've got the factories, we've got which is now the distribution centers, let's be clear. And we also have, you know, healthcare workers. A great majority of healthcare workers of color are low waged, under-resourced, inability to actually earn a living wage, yet they are caring for our population, right? And so how is it that we can start to tell stories in a way to reclaim our health, our wellness, our land, our language, our terms, our songs? That's one thing I wonder. And I like that I saw so beautifully, just I think that drum, that visual of that drum, Peter, and the drumming circle, like that evokes so much for me in so many cultures, right? And we often don't have these drumming circles. That's how, you know, women used to talk about health, menopause, having children, like our ability to talk about things came from the healing power of a drum. And I think we should just come back to telling those stories and translating through storytelling.
You know, it's interesting. I was reading this article about in Japan. Well, first of all, in the United States, I think the average kid spends about 9 to 10 minutes in an outdoor space, in green spaces. And they're finding now that when we have limited access to the natural world, our blood pressure goes up, cortisol levels, stress levels. And so like in Japan and in European countries, medical doctors are prescribing tree baths. You know, hey, go walk in the park for 15 minutes. And so, you know, this goes back to this whole idea of a systems change. Because as we see what's happening right now, like I've been really paying attention to what's happening with the critical race theory backlash right now. I think in 21 states, they're passing legislation to like ban changing the narrative.
Yeah.
And that's key, because all this is a story. All these are stories. And so what I see happening in the communities is you see young people, they're thinking and going outside of the current system, the current narrative, because the answers are not going to come from this system, because it's the system that's responsible for the inequity and the problem in the first place. So the solutions I see will come and are coming from the margins, and from young people who are, like you're saying, Natalie, they're not encumbered. They're going out into the land, and they're starting. And so for me, no matter what the backlash is, like this is a wave that's coming. And I think what we're seeing, and just what you held up, that little thing about the Senate passing, you know, recognizing that the shift, it's happening. This wave is moving, and the planet is talking to us. The Mother Earth is talking to us. And I think a lot of our warriors, thought leaders, organizers that are in the trenches every day, they're responding. And so that's where I take my inspiration. And I think, Natalie, you got your hand on the pulse as well, as do you, Adamica. And all these issues, like at the village, we have to center medical, dental, and behavioral health because like diabetes in our community, it's the smallpox of the 21st century, and it goes to what you talk about now about food deserts and food apartheid and creating access to to healthy, organic, locally grown foods, which again goes back to connection with land. So it's all interrelated. But I just that we're having this conversation, you see these kind of movements exploding across the country, tells me like the ancestors are backing us up and we're moving in the right direction.
I think that one of the things that I often think about when we do panels like this is like what a life of privilege we lead to be able to sit here and talk about liberation on Zoom, right? And I want to just acknowledge that and acknowledge all the folks who cannot be here either because, they don't have access to broadband or because we don't have their name on our email list or whatever, or because they have to work tonight. And I think that the other side of that is that because folks who speak on panels like this and folks who attend panels like this often have a point or a position of privilege in one way or another, which means that we have, from our position, there are things that we can do to advance these conversations. And I want to have a conversation now about what we should be doing, those of us who, on the scale of privilege sit in one place or another, and how we can actually roll up our sleeves and participate instead of sitting around and talking about it, which we love to do and it's important to do. But like for each of you, what should folks be doing to advance your version of freedom?
Well, I'll jump in. I was having this conversation, and Anasa, you'll appreciate this. I was having a similar conversation with Conda Mason, who is, for those of you who out there who don't know, Conda is she described herself as a social justice entrepreneur. She founded Impact Hub here in Oakland and has recently relocated to Louisiana to help Black farmers in their rice production, which has everything to do with, climate change. And she's just doing it. And I was inspired and I was telling her, and I'm just being totally honest here, I was telling her, so often people come to me and they ask, what can I do? And I sometimes don't feel like I have a sufficient answer, right? I point people to the Soul Fire Farm or whatever, right? Or their whatever, the organizations that I know. But I was telling her that, a lot of people want to write a check, which is great, but we need more than that, right? And she made the observation, she said, there's a lot of internal work that people need to do, right? It's not just about the external. It's not just about, writing a check or volunteering at your local, community garden, right? It's about the internal work and really investigating the ways we all are moving through the world. And in many ways, that is more powerful or as powerful as the exterior work, right? The gestures that we all want to make. And so she pointed me to this website called Reparations for Slavery. Reparations for, the number 4, slavery. And it's deep, y'all. I mean, it is, it is really a website that takes you on a journey and asks you to sit with yourself and think about your story and your family's story, right? Before you do anything, right? It's about interrogating the assumptions that we all have made about our lives and our privilege or lack of it. And so I would just, I see Anasi, you put that in the chat. As a first step, I would encourage people to go there and check it out. Whether you believe in reparations or not, I think is beside the point, whatever form that takes. But I really appreciated Conda's observation, because I really do think that unless we're all willing to do that internal work, anything else is really an empty gesture at the end of the day, because you're not accountable, right? And you're not likely to follow through, right? And live by these words. So
I was
just throwing that out there.
Same conversation today, and I just want you to know you are in here preaching to me right now, because what I have learned in my short, kind of long life, recently especially, is that sometimes I'm like, oh my God, you're being racist. And then sometimes I'm like, wait, no, I'm not saying you're not racist or patriarchal, but what I am saying is you don't have the emotional fortitude to even have a difficult conversation. And what I'm finding is like so many times people's lack of emotional health and ability to engage in authentic, vulnerable conversations is so often in the way of us being able to have real conversations about how we move forward. Yeah. And I'm like, whoa, it's either white supremacy, patriarchy, or you just don't know how to have a hard conversation. And sometimes it's all three. So yes, amen to all that you said. I also I'm going to put another movie in the chat called Traces of the Trade. That's about this woman who found out her family was participating in the slave trade, and they were like good liberal Northeasterners. And it's like a really powerful film to watch and have a different perspective about participation in the slave trade and what it means for families in the 21st century. And then I'm gonna stop talking so Adamica and Peter, y'all can answer that question about like, what should we be doing?
Adamica, you want to jump in? I'll go after you. Or
okay. So I have a specific ask because what's not lost on me every day is people are dying.
Yeah.
Every day. And I spend a lot of my time thinking about what is the value proposition for, in whatever industry, in whatever business you're in, thinking about those, you know, to the left and the right of you in the grocery store, the left and the right of you as you're driving down the freeway, right? Like the remainder of our community. And I think it's really about having authentic conversations. So one, I think holding space and giving time to have conversations, to really walk through understanding the other sides of the argument. And I'll say that as like someone who spends a lot of time in Silicon Valley, kind of telling health tech entrepreneurs, you know, there's more than a business case of just serving people who have discretionary income or who have a job and their employer-based coverage, or we really have to start thinking further, right? Because our innovations are only going to be as good as our ability to be able to save our largest economic engine in this country, which is our health. If our people in this country aren't healthy, we can't contribute, right? We can't work the fields. We can't open up the grocery stores. We can't be in the fields to bring you your food, right? Like, so I think one thing is just start to have conversations that we have traditionally been unwilling to have. And really, Anasa, it really is centering our power and our privilege, because we all have some form of power and privilege. And thinking about, of the power and privilege that you hold, what can you start to transform or translate, right? And how you can do that effortlessly. Everyone on this call has a Rolodex, has people that they can connect others to, has the ability to open up or hold spaces and have conversations, whether it be in your living room or, you know, at the Battery, for instance, right? And I think we need to get to a place where we understand we don't have a lot of time. People are dying every single day, not by their own volition, but because we have decided as a society that they're not important enough. And oftentimes we don't realize it until it's too late, until you're the person on the other end and on the other side of recognizing and realizing that really the humanity is part of the beauty of living here. It's like the price and the beauty, that the currency of living here on earth. So that is my ask. My ask is thinking about centering your own power and privilege, and starting to think about having tough conversations. And Natalie, I love that you gave people a tool so that they can start to take a self journey. But I would say health is our greatest wealth. And I'd love to, and I welcome, having conversations with others, because I'm always trying to figure out alternative viewpoints so that I can go into situations and advocate for everyone. And I will say that checks are not bad. They do help move engines. As someone who runs a nonprofit, I will tell you checks do help.
Fair enough.
But as we think about underrepresented founders and we think about individuals that are coming up with solutions that are actually going to make a difference, like Peter said, like oftentimes those of us who are trying to make solutions based upon our lived experience that will impact and benefit everyone else, they also need to be given an opportunity. And I think our financial structures, our educational structures, you know, have made it so that this Juneteenth that we're talking about here, where we have this 2.5 years deferred, we have 400.5 years deferred, to be quite honest with you. There have been a lot of ways in which we're further behind, not by not trying hard enough, not by not working hard enough, by not given the same level of opportunity. So that's my ask. My ask is to like open up your mind to think about the spaces that you can start having different conversations with different people around the table. Ask who's not there. And if you don't know, you know, anyone who should be there, ask one of us, ask others, right? Like, who should I be inviting to this meeting? And then help with that value proposition around health and wealth, right? Like that is going to be the engine that's going to keep this great nation moving ahead. Peter, all you.
That's a great question, Nasa. And I'm reminded of a few things. I had a conversation with a really good sister of mine, Adamica. She's a tribal judge up in Yurok country. Yuroks are the largest tribe in California. And I get to work with her when I work at the Friendship House in San Francisco. And one day I was talking about, you know, our rights, and, you know, and our rights are being violated, and we got these rights and those rights. And she reminded me, she said, you know, brother, a lot of our tribes, our indigenous teachings, we were not rights-based, but responsibility-based. We were a responsibility-based culture. And so we, you know, we have certain responsibilities and duties as a human being, not just to our immediate families, our communities, our tribe, our nation, but also to the natural world. And then, you know, that's why they say, a lot of our elders, they talk about, you know, when you make decisions, you know, you put on the good mind and you look way down into the future. And so, you know, especially on thinking about Juneteenth and thinking about a lot of the ancestral people, you know, they knew, like my mom's generation, she's, you know, when they were struggling, they always said, yeah, they didn't expect to see victory. You know, they didn't expect to see that. And they really were like buttoning down and making their bundles, and sometimes, you know, they had to take ceremonies, they had to take things underground and hide them and preserve them for us to utilize. You saw that drum in the video. That drum is only here because somebody laid down their life. So, like, when we think about like our privilege, what do we, you know, I'm reminded of the great poet and novelist June Jordan, who I had the privilege of knowing and hanging out with. And I went to sit in her class one time, and it was mostly, you know, writers of color. And it was the first day of class, and she said in the opening minutes, you know, before we begin this course, before you open a book, before I write anything on the chalkboard, I want to pose one question. She said, by the virtue of you sitting in this classroom at the University of California, Berkeley, you're privileged. What are you going to do with your privilege? And so, like, that sits with me. And so I think about, like, what is my responsibility now that I've hit this kind of halfway point on the road of life. And then another thing I heard, this was actually a few years ago, Alice Walker, another good sister, man. I heard her talking with Amy Goodman on Democracy Now! And she said, oh, you know, I forget what they were talking about. But she said, you know, Amy, this is the most exciting time to be alive and to be human. And Amy said, wait a minute, Alice, you know, the world's never been more violent and dangerous. How can, you know, climate change, how can you say like it's the most exciting time? And Alice she said, well, you know, Amy, I really believe that as human beings, we find our deepest meaning and deep peace in hard work. And never has there been so much hard work to do. And so I think with our privilege, you know, with that, we have to be like the Dolores Huertas of the world. We have to use every opportunity to organize. And that starts, you know, in your own home, your family, your community. It means registering to vote. It means more than just cutting a check if you're a philanthropist. You know, it means really getting involved and connecting with people in your community, people outside your community, but it really means getting involved and organizing. You know, that's the only way, you know, we're going to move forward. And I remember somebody, we were traveling around with Dolores with the film, and they said, you know, Dolores, how do you know who's a good how do you know who's a good leader? And she said, oh, that's easy. The leaders are the ones who show up and do the work. So we need people to show up and do the work. And you know, that includes all of us, you know, that includes all of us.
For sure. I just want to acknowledge that we lost Adamica for a few minutes. I think she was having some issues with her connection. We hope that she comes back, and we're going to send her a blessing and some prayers so she could not be freaking out with her technology while she's gone. I want to offer one other thing that I think is really important for us to say when we're talking about what folks can do, and that is something that that I have been really sitting with a lot because of, you know, my moving to Memphis and spending as much time as I am here with the community of people who have been living and working here for so long, and that is really to listen. When you're a person who sits in the place of privilege and you know that you are supposed to be leveraging that privilege for your own and other people's liberation, it's really important that you learn how to listen to the people who are most impacted, who are sitting at the furthest edges of the margins, who are having the hardest time to access all of the things that they need for their own liberation. Because oftentimes, she's back, hi. Oftentimes, as people who sit in again on the spectrum of privilege, we're taught that if you have a certain amount of access to education or to financial resource, or if you're a man, or if you're whatever your thing is, right, is that you have the answers, and that you're supposed to like show up and do stuff to help other people get free, as opposed to showing up in service and with open ears and open hearts and really listening. And like you said, Peter, really building deep community with folks so that you can earn their trust such that they can show you what they need and how you need to show up. And that's something that I know is really hard sometimes and takes a lot of like humbling, and that what Natalie was talking about, that like emotional and spiritual maturity to show up as a person who believes you have the answers and just be quiet and take your direction from someone who you perceive to not be as powerful as you. And that's hardly ever the case. Welcome back, Adamica. We're so happy that you're back. Hope you weren't freaking out that time. we were just waiting for you with patience and love.
The beauty of telehealth equity.
Yes. We do have, I want to take a pause for just a minute because we do have a question in the chat that I want to bring to the floor. If anyone else has any questions or comments that they want to bring to the floor, please feel free to put them in the Q&A box now. Someone, an anonymous attendee, how mysterious, wants to know, what are some of the contradictions that Black and Indigenous ordinary folk need to work through to be in solidarity? I'm assuming that she means with each other. And that's something that we've both talked about, Peter and Natalie, around like the power of alliance between and community and family between Black and Indigenous communities. And where are we in that conversation? What is happening in that, on that landscape? And how do we, you know, get to be family?
I was just going to say, Natalie and I had this conversation just this weekend. And I think that,
chime in.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that there's a trust factor, right? And I think that there's this ability to, we are socialized to, you know, under a colonization framework, right? The colonization framework is look to the left, look to the right, right? Like, only be out for yourself, like only, you know, and I think that we have to go back to, and I, you know, Peter's village, you know, like trailer is playing in my mind, right? Like we've got to go back to trust,
yes,
and knowing the power of our collective wisdom. Like we are taught that, you know, in many ways we're taught to not collectively come together because that that power is too powerful for others to, that they worry about, what are you talking about by yourselves over there? We can go back and reclaim that as being a beautiful thing, right? And model that for our children and model that for others.
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the for BIPOC communities, we have something in common. That the root cause of racial inequity is systemic racism and white supremacy. So that's kind of been our common ground, and state sanctioned violence. We also have that common history, but there's a lot of decolonizing I think that we have to do in all of our communities. I'm reminded of the brilliant film I'm Not Your Negro, where Baldwin is, recounting growing up and going to the movie theaters and like seeing the cowboys shoot down the Indians, and they show all the black and white footage. He says, in my mind, I was the cowboys. And then much later in life, he said, then it dawned on me, as a black man, I'm the Indian. So I think those moments of awakening have happened throughout the country, and there's an incredible, oftentimes we define and look at our narrative and our lens is our community, our people in relationship to the dominant culture and not necessarily to each other. And yet, Indigenous and Black people have this incredibly rich history throughout the Western Hemisphere. And we got to tap that. We got to tell those stories. And there's solidarity, kind of woven throughout the centuries of that history. And I'm thinking about like when I was a child on Alcatraz, like I remember the Black Panthers, bringing over clothes and food and like putting a stake in the ground saying like, we are with you. I remember Muhammad Ali marching with Native people like in the 70s. I remember the farm workers coming to support Angela Davis, when she was on trial. So there's an incredibly rich history of solidarity and working across movements. But at the same time, we have to decolonize because we have assimilated a lot of the dominant cultures and the colonizers' cosmology and views, including like, how sometimes we see ourselves or others as inferior. We talk about good hair, light skin, colorism, all those things. But a lot of our communities have been informed by the dominant narratives. And so as more of our storytellers kind of come to the fore, people like Natalie, what you're doing, that narrative is shifting. And so there's a decolonizing process that is happening. But we do need to address that, and at the same time work towards that solidarity to get the root cause.
I'm looking at the time, and we set this for 90 minutes because every time I talk to y'all, I'm like, an hour is never enough. And I knew it wasn't going to be enough. So we have just about 15 more minutes, and I'm going to wrap us up. And I want to bring this back to my favorite thing to talk about when I talk about transformation and liberation. And it really is conversations about culture and story. Adamica brought it up first, and it's come up again and again and again. And Peter and Natalie, you are two of my favorite storytellers. And I think we would be remiss to not take a moment to just acknowledge the power of story and narrative when you're working to shift culture. It just is really, you cannot do it without story. I talk all the time about the fact that there is no civil rights movement if there's no Harlem Renaissance. Like, you have to do the work of bringing your humanity forth before you can pass the policy. It just is what it is, right? And while we are focused today on a story of the past, and we're talking about the ending of chattel slavery here in America, and the communication of that end so much longer than it needed to be. But I want to ask you as we close, what is your story of future freedom? Because one of the things that's so powerful about the three of you is you actually spend all your time every day, even in your sleep, creating the future of freedom for all of us. And I just want for you to leave us with the words of your story of future freedom. And then we will say a few thank yous, and we will bid everyone good night. And you can go in whatever order you feel so moved. You guys are so cute.
I will volunteer, and I feel like Natalie is pointing us in a direction that's gonna bring us together, and that's the land. That's the Mother Earth. And you know, I was reminded of you know, I went to my first bar mitzvah a couple years ago, and the young man, you know, he got up there and he talked about how he didn't want to participate in you know, study the Torah and you know, read about the Exodus story. And then he got up there and he saw his grandmas and his aunts who came from all over the country, and you know, he was fighting back tears, and he said, you know, I realized that it's the Exodus story, it's this story that makes us a people, and it's really the earth, you know, that makes us human beings. And that really, somewhere, it's that connection that we all have to the land. There's a story in there that's going to unite us, and I think, you know, Natalie, her work is pointing us. We're yearning for that connection. There's exciting movements happening right now. You know, in Cochabamba in 2010, Evo Morales and the Quechua people, they came out and they had the Declaration, the Rights of Mother Earth, and people all over the world have taken that, and their rivers are getting recognized. They're getting personhood. You know, forests, mountains. And if we could get to that place where we recognize the planet is having consciousness, we will change. It will force us to change. And so I don't have the exact map, but Natalie, I'm following you.
Wow. Well, Peter, thank you for that. You know, I feel like my voice is really just one voice, just trying to do whatever I can to, you know, elevate and amplify the work of these people who are moving us forward. You know, I think about Anasa, your question, and this whole idea of, you know, us being colonized, and I do think that that's true. But when I hear these young people who are involved with agriculture, and they're not thinking about themselves, you know, they are thinking in terms of inclusion. That is the language that they speak. It is in the way they grow food. It is in the way they build community. It is in the way they, you know, imagine a new paradigm. And that's what makes me hopeful. I am praying that we are witnessing the last gasp of white supremacy, you know, this surge, whether it's voting rights, which is another thing that just, oh, really, you know, it's my personal thing, you know, and to see the way people are trying to institute policies and practices to disenfranchise people of color. And yet we continue to surge forward in spite of all that. And so that is what gives me hope. Future freedom, that's what I think about, you know, and I do think, I think it's connected to the land. I think that we have reached a tipping point where people are starting to understand that if we are going to survive on this planet, we're going to have to work together. We really don't have a choice. We are, you know, and I also wanted to share, I was thinking about this amazing documentary series that Chef Matthew Rayford turned me on to, called Exterminate All the Brutes. Man, that is some powerful stuff. And it chronicles the whole history from, you know, the 1200s, 1100s to today. And it really unpacks this idea of how we got here and how it is that we have this mindset of erasure and extermination and total domination, and what and how that has led us to this point. And so I just want to say that if you haven't seen this film series, you have to check it out because it is really powerful and it does a lot to explain the systems that we all find ourselves victims of, but it's just powerful. So again, that's my little contribution.
I want to tie those themes together, right? I'm thinking a little bit about the Exodus, like the concepts of freedom and responsibility in the Exodus narrative that Peter talked about, and what history has told us when we neglect our land, right? Our demolishing of our public health system, right? And not thinking about kind of housing, sanitation, labor efforts, right? What happens? So when I think about a future freedom, and I love that you brought the Bar Mitzvah story in, because it reminds me a lot of many of our iconic leaders. We don't tell all of those stories. So if you think of Louis Armstrong and you think of the Jewish family that bought him his first instrument, right? It says something about how we have to work collectively together to allow our beauty and our gifts and the gifts of our culture to fortify and to come alive, right? So when I think of future freedom, it's like, how can we help people radicalized in kind of extreme conditions, right? Get out through kind of non-judgment conversations and healing, right? How can we advance our freedom by providing kind of an uncompromising moral and economic case for liberty and freedom, and like redefining and reclaiming that freedom can be collective and that we can work together to define a new storyline of freedom. And that could be through our stories of history and through the incredible lifeblood of our youth. Like, I think Natalie has just spoken so beautifully about our generations and what we're willing to put up with, right? What are the generations that we're raising and their tolerance. So I do think that there's an ability for us to work together collectively to change and refine and redefine our freedoms.
Thank you all so much. Before we go, I want to give you each a chance to tell folks how to find you. And you can put your website or your social media in the chat so that they can connect with you later. I'm gonna be quiet for 2 minutes and let y'all do that, and then we can close out. Are you all typing? Oh!
Should have told us before, this is not liberating our freedom.
You can say it out loud too. Tell the people where they can find you.
Funny.
Natalie, what's your website?
NatalieBazile.com.
Amazing. And are you on social media?
I am mostly on Instagram. I'm not a Facebook user. Don't like it.
Yeah, no.
Don't like it. Instagram is not Facebook, right? But
I was gonna say the same thing, yet we go back.
You're in hoodwink.
and I'm on Twitter, but I'm not really, that's not my platform. I don't do a lot of tweeting. But I do, will keep in touch with folks mostly on Instagram. So between that and my website.
Awesome. Adamica, where can we find you?
I put my email and website in the chat. I'm on both Instagram and Twitter as Madam Medicaid. Yes. The ability to turn any coffee table conversation into a Medicaid conversation. So
I love it. Peter, how about you? Where can we hear about you and all of your amazing work and the Village FF?
I posted it, I think, on the host, but I'm with the Friendship House Association of American Indians in San Francisco. I'm the lead on the Village Project, and I unfortunately I don't Facebook or or social media.
You're much too cool for that. We get it. I want to thank you all three of you, so very much. It was such an amazing conversation. I feel like I learned something from each one of you, which happens every time we talk, actually. Thank you, everybody out there out in the webinar land, for being here. I want to thank Tanum Davis Bowen and Warrington Parker, who are with the Perspective Society with the Battery. And we want to, of course, thank the Battery. I am Anasa Troutman with the Big We. You can follow me on Instagram, mostly, kind of Facebook, like Natalie. I'm like, not really, but okay, if that's your thing. And you can also reach us, thebigwe.com. Have a podcast. If you like to hear me talk, you can listen to our podcast and hear me talk for a whole hour. Just go to our website. It's the Big We Podcast on wherever you get your podcast. I'm going to turn it back over to Tanum to take us out. Thank you, everybody. I love y'all so much. I can't wait to see you in person and hug your necks. I can't wait to see you guys. All right. Thank you.
I'll make it quick. Thank you so much. That was actually so much fun to hear you guys talk. I'm back here and I have notes, and I will not do my takeaways, but I want you to know that I took copious notes. But the one thing that I hear is find a way to make your privilege matter. And if you are in a position and you sit in the place of privilege, make sure you're listening to people so that you're actually giving them what they need. And then Peter, for yours, leaders show up and do the work. Absolutely. Everybody has to put all hands on deck. Okay, so the three asks that we'll have from you from tonight's discussion. One, if you're a member of the Battery community, Colleen put it in the chat. Join us, please, on Saturday, June the 19th, to experience firsthand a celebration of the historic moment. And Cece in the chat, the Senate passed the bill. It still has to go to the House of Representatives, and it still has to go to President. But I'm thinking that's the easy one. But we're gonna claim it and make it happen. Secondly, if you found tonight's conversation interesting and are part of the Battery community, please join us for future conversations. Our intention is to plan a cross-section of the Battery members in discussions where possible. And we're going to focus on sharing different perspectives to increase understanding, inspire transformation, and for self and others, and to highlight these intersectional, connected cultural flashpoints that we all are part of. And then last but not least, Nasa already said, please research the village. Go find Peter, HT4M, and buy Natalie's book. It's on Amazon. It is amazing to learn more.
I both of Natalie's books, both of them, fiction and nonfiction.
So do I. And a special thank you to Peter, Anasa, Adamica, Natalie. Thank you so much for this intriguing discussion. And thank you to the Battery and Colleen specifically. So have a great evening and happy Juneteenth.